I really recommend that you read this page one New York Times above the fold story, how a political crisis spilled out of a lurid, unverified dossier. Scott Shane shares the byline with two of his colleagues, and I'm thrilled that he's come back to the program now to give us the CliffsNote version. Scott, how are you? Thank you for being here.
Great. Glad to be with you.
So the fall of 2015, there's an unnamed wealthy Republican donor. He wants opposition research on Donald Trump, and that's where it begins.
Yeah, I mean, that is completely standard practice in politics these days, especially presidential politics, where a campaign or a supporter of a candidate, engages some kind of research operation to dig into the resume of the opponent, and it's not considered illicit. It's considered just sort of part of the game. What happened, and that it began that way, and of course Donald Trump has quite an extensive record, which this Washington firm began to put together. But things took a turn back in June, when the Washington Post first reported that it appeared that Russia had hacked into the Democratic National Committee. And at that point, the Washington firm hired a retired British intelligence officer with long experience with Russia to look specifically at the relationship between Trump and Russia. And that is what produced that British intelligence officer is the person who came up with a series of memos based on what sources in Russia said about Trump's conduct in Russia and his relationships there, and also, maybe most importantly, the Russian government's attitude toward him. Essentially, if you add up these memos, they suggest that for quite a few years now, the Russian intelligence services have tried various means, experimented with various means of getting their hooks into Donald Trump. Essentially turning him into what they sometimes call an agent of influence. Somebody who would provide information in return, maybe for some information, keep an eye on, for example, Russian oligarchs in the West who might be in deals with Trump, and so on. But there's more to it. There's also allegations of attempted bribes in the form of real estate deals, and perhaps most famously now, the notion that there are sex tapes of Trump with prostitutes in a Moscow hotel. Now, I should say, as we keep saying in print, that none of this has been substantiated, and it's certainly conceivable when you think about what the Russian government is now, understood to have done with Hillary Clinton, and that is engage in hacking and leaking in order to damage her reputation and her, position in the election. It's certainly conceivable that the Russians invented some of this stuff, leaked it to the retired British intelligence officer as part of an operation to weaken Donald Trump should he become president. So we really do not know whether any of this stuff is true.
The firm that was engaged by the wealthy benefactor initially to do the opposition research is called GPS Fusion, and they're headed by a former Wall Street journalist, reporter named Glenn Simpson. This is all in your reporting. And Simpson engages Christopher Steele, who is a former British spy. Those are the key individuals, at least as far as we know the story thus far.
I think that's right. Yeah, that's
and
exactly right.
Steele, the former British spy, reputable as far as your reporting reveals?
Yes, everybody we've talked to, sort of former colleagues in American intelligence and so on, speak very highly of. He's a very solid guy with deep knowledge of Russia, and they have no reason to think that he would be easily played by Russian disinformation or certainly that he would make any of this stuff up. So, he comes with a very good reputation to this story.
So as I understand it, the Republican benefactor, by the way, you haven't published his name, and I'm curious, does the Times know who that individual is, the individual who first hired Fusion GPS?
We have some notions about who it might be, but we do not know for sure.
And my understanding,
he's just described to us in generic terms as a wealthy donor who really did not like Trump. And so the idea was, whether he supported one of the other Republican candidates or, perhaps just wanted someone other than Trump. There were, of course, plenty of Republicans who were in the sort of never Trump camp at that point. He thought, essentially, he wanted to dig up whatever he could find on Trump that might damage Trump's candidacy.
And when Trump then becomes the Republican nominee, his interest fades, but unnamed Democrats continue to pay the tab so that Fusion GPS...
Exactly. So the Democrats took over the account, so to speak, and continued to pay the Washington firm to, sort of fill out this dossier on Mr. Trump. And the only thing that's unusual in this is, for most candidates, it never takes a turn into the realm of sort of, foreign affairs and espionage and so on. In this case, it did, and that's what's raised the stakes so much for this story.
What do we know, Scott, as to what the briefing consisted of last Friday pertaining to the two-page summary? I guess I'm asking it awkwardly. Was Donald Trump verbally advised about the 2 pages, or were they just appended to the briefing that he received, the written briefing?
There are contradictory accounts of that, but I believe that he was not told verbally about it, but it was attached to this report. I think the notion on the part of the intelligence officials who put what they acknowledge is unsubstantiated, unproven material into this 2-page summary. I think their feeling was that this was known all over Washington, and I can certainly vouch for that. We were given the documents weeks ago, and many reporters have been trying to check on these stories for quite a while, and they thought Mr. Trump would perhaps understandably be really put out if he found out he was the only guy in town who wasn't aware of this dossier circulating about him. And so, perhaps, obviously it's an awkward situation. You're presenting to Mr. Trump some really salacious and defamatory claims about him and his conduct. So, it's an awkward situation, but I think that, perhaps by not mentioning it verbally, but putting it in the written report, which certainly his aides would have read in detail, they're sort of passing, sort of a word to the wise without undue emphasis. But of course, that led to the leak to CNN and the decision of many news organizations, including mine, to write about these memos, this dossier, which we had for some time but had not written about.
And then to walk a tightrope and to report on the fact that he was briefed without, whether it's CNN or the New York Times, linking to the 35 or so pages the way in which BuzzFeed has.
Yeah, it's, this is sort of a fact of the internet age. We decided not to publish the memos ourselves because we thought that to lay out all their claims, which we, have not been able to prove ourselves, would just be going too far. But at the same time, we have included in our stories a few paragraphs that summarize the claims in those memos, because we felt it was impossible to understand what was going on, what the hubbub is about, without at least having some idea of the nature of the allegations in there.
And finally, what do we know of Mr. Steele? I understand that he's left his home in the UK and maybe not worried about his safety. Do you expect that there'll be more heard from him in this regard?
We have not ourselves done reporting on, his alleged fears and the fact that he may have left his home for a period of time. As everybody knows, the Russian government under Vladimir Putin plays pretty rough, and he may have legitimate concerns about his well-being. One certainly hopes that nothing happens to him, and that this plays out in a peaceful way. It will be very, very interesting if he, decides to go public. Essentially, the president-elect of the United States has called his reporting, his investigation, fake news and made up by sick people and so on. Perhaps Mr. Steele will choose in some way to go public to say what he intended by putting this dossier together, and how much faith he has in the veracity of these claims.
I highly recommend what you wrote for today's front page of the New York Times, and I'm very appreciative to Scott Shane for giving our audience the briefing. Thank you so much for that, Scott.
Thank you, Michael.
So there's a great summary of what we now know in terms of the backstory